Trusted travel booking partner. Download the Trip.com app and discover amazing travel deals.
Our English. Try one.
Chapter 1. Captain MacWhirr.
There's some bad weather out there,
Captain MacWhirr said to himself, looking at the barometer. He was a quiet man who never looked for trouble and rarely found it. When he talked, which was not often, he used few words. This made some people think that he was not so clever. He had blue eyes, not much hair on top of his head, with thin yellow hair around the back and sides, and thick red hair on his face. He had a strong, thick, short body. On shore, it didn't matter where, he always wore the same brown hat, brown suit, and heavy black boots. But everyone who worked with him knew that he was a good captain. Ships under his command arrived on time, and he never had trouble with his crews. When he was 15, MacWhirr ran away from home in Ireland to be a sailor. He didn't tell his mother and father, who had a shop in Belfast, where he was, until 8 months later, when he sent them a letter from Chile. Year after year, he worked on different ships, and didn't go home very often. But he wrote many letters home from all over the world. They were short, and always gave news about the weather. It's very hot here, or on Christmas Day, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it was very cold. In time, he met a young woman that he liked. Her name was Lucy, but he did not have time to write much about her to his mother and father, because they died. MacWhirr married Lucy not long after he was given his first job as the captain of a ship. The Nan Shan was 3 years old and was made in Dumbarton, in Scotland. She was a fine, strong ship, neither too narrow nor too deep, and good in stormy weather. At first, the Nan Shan sailed under a British flag, but then the owner, Mr. Sigg, decided that it would be better to change to the old Thai flag. This was red, with a big white elephant in the middle of it. Jukes, the first mate, felt uncomfortable sailing under Thai colours.
It looks strange to me, that flag with the elephant on it,
he said to Captain MacWhirr.
I don't like it.
There's nothing wrong with it,
replied Captain MacWhirr, looking up at the flag.
You just have to make sure that the crew put it the right way up.
Jukes wasn't happy with the captain's answer. Later, down on deck, he told Solomon Rout about it. Rout, taking time out from the engine room, was the chief engineer. He was a tall, fatherly man, and often listened, smiling, to young Jukes' stories.
I can't understand the captain,
Said Jukes.
You say one thing to him, and he takes it another way. I was ready to leave my job, because we're now sailing under that Thai flag. But all he could say was that you had to put it up the right way.
And did you leave your job?
Asked Rout, smiling. After many years' work on ships all over the world, Rout knew how important it was to have, and not to lose, a good job.
No, I didn't.
Replied Jukes. He felt a little angry with himself, because he talked of it, but didn't do it.
Rout?
Said the captain, arriving just then.
Yes, sir.
Rout replied.
We're sailing for Fu Chau this afternoon. The engines must be ready for 1 o'clock. And Jukes,
Yes, sir?
we're taking 200 Chinese laborers with us. They're arriving in about 20 minutes. During the day, they can stay on deck. And at night, they'll sleep in the hold. Make sure that there's room for them and their boxes.
Yes, sir.
Said Jukes. And with that, the captain went to his room, and Rout and Jukes hurried away to do their work. The 200 Chinese workers were going back to their villages after 7 years of work away from home. They all wore the same dark clothes, and each one carried a little box which was made of wood. In this box was everything that they had in the world, and all their work money. Each one kept his box near him at all times. When they came onto the Nan Shan, Jukes told them where to go. Because the Chinese laborers couldn't speak English very well, he explained everything very loudly and slowly to them.
You sleep here. You cook food here. And here you eat. In fine weather, you can come up, walk on deck, and enjoy the sea air.
Did the Chinese workers understand him? Their tired faces didn't show what they were really thinking, so it was difficult to be sure. In 4 hours, the ship would leave for Fu Chau. There was just time to write to family and friends, and McWhirr, Rout, and Jukes all wanted to send letters before leaving. McWhirr's letter was to his wife. Spending so much time at sea, Captain McWhirr didn't understand his wife and their 2 children, Lydia and Tom, very well. He knew little about their lives, and had little to tell them about his life. Lucy McWhirr usually didn't read her husband's letters very carefully. They spoke about the weather, the sea, and other things that she didn't really find very interesting. Her one great worry was that one day he would come back and want to live at home with her all the time. So she read his letters, looking for any words about that.
Remember me to the children, your loving husband,
wrote McWhirr, before he put his name at the bottom. Rout's letters were much fuller, and his wife always enjoyed reading them. She lived with Rout's mother, who couldn't hear very well and needed help. And she often read the really interesting parts of her husband's letters very loudly to the old woman.
I prefer a slow captain who does no wrong to a quick-thinking criminal one. They're easier to work with,
wrote Rout to his wife, thinking of McWhirr. Jukes always wrote to a friend of his, a sailor on another ship, and he usually described everything that happened in his life and how he thought and felt about it. In this letter, he wrote,
The other day, I was talking with one of the crew for a while, and later, the captain asked me, "Was that you talking?" I said, "Yes." "For 2 hours," he said. "What do you find to talk about?" When we're on shore, I see people talking all day, and then, in the evening, they go on talking over drinks. Surely they're saying the same things over again. I can't understand it. Isn't he a strange man? Sometimes he makes me angry, and sometimes I feel sorry for him, because I think that he doesn't really understand anything of life at all.
After the 3 writers finished and posted their letters, the Nan Shan was ready to go on her way.
Ui, mahalnya harga tiket. Macam mana nak pergi bercuti ni? Kita cuba cara lain.
Tapi nak duit.
Alamak, kantoi. Kenapa mahal sangat tiket belakang kaunter ni? Begitulah cerita dia.
Itulah kau. Cari lagi tiket di kaunter. Lain kali, pakailah RedBus. Pelbagai diskaun retail dan pulangan tunai menanti anda. Kan Jumaat tu, RedBus lebih murah dari kaunter. Guna kod dan cok tempat dengan RedBus.
Kau suka tak benda yang laju-laju, benda yang pantas? Ni, dengan OTAFX, dia menyediakan withdrawal terpantas bawah 19 minit. Kat sini aku ajar macam mana nak withdraw. Okey, kau pergi klik dekat account, lepas tu kau pilih je account mana nak withdraw, lepas tu kau tekan, and then kau tekan je withdraw. So dekat sini, banyak option yang korang boleh pilih untuk withdraw. Kalau korang withdraw lebih daripada 19 minit, korang boleh claim 100% bonus. Tunggu apa lagi? Downloadlah OTAFX Trading App sekarang. Kau tengok, Maggi aku pun belum lembut. Dah masuk.
Chapter 2. Things get hotter. Once the Nan Shan was out at sea, Captain McWhirr looked at the barometer again.
Yes, There's some really dirty weather out there, that's for sure.
He said to himself. He was not worried by the way the weather was changing, and he didn't feel at all afraid at the idea of a typhoon. Spending most of his life at sea, he knew many different kinds of weather, and a typhoon was just another kind of bad weather for him. But perhaps Captain MacWhirr did not fully know the real power of the sea. Of course, he knew about typhoons, and he knew that they sometimes happened in the China Sea. Before becoming a captain, he read about typhoons in books, and he heard about them from other sailors. But to be in the middle of a very strong typhoon, in which the sea showed all its fury and its terrible power, no, this was something that MacWhirr himself did not really know. The swell was getting stronger, and the ship started rolling slowly and heavily from side to side. It was now late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to go down. It was very hot. There was no wind at all, and MacWhirr could feel the storm in the air. Perhaps everyone on the Nan Shan could feel it, because there was a heavy, angry feeling everywhere on the ship. Most of the Chinese laborers were on deck, spending the time in different ways. Some were looking out to sea, bored. Some were smoking, and some had their shirts off and were pulling up buckets full of seawater from over the side of the ship to wash in, because they were so hot. 3 of them were pointing at one of their boxes and shouting. Perhaps they were talking angrily about money, thought MacWhirr. The rest of them were sleeping quietly. Below deck, it was worse. The temperature in the engine room was 117 degrees, and the air was full of angry voices and the loud noise of metal on metal. The second engineer, a big, strong man called Harry, was shouting at his men because there was not enough steam. Harry often shouted, and usually the men worked quietly under him. But today, they were as angry as he was. To make more steam, they needed more air from the ventilators, and there was none. Harry came up on deck to see why this was, and found Jukes.
How can my men give us enough steam if the ventilators aren't catching the wind?
He shouted.
The ventilators aren't the problem,
said Jukes.
There's no wind. That's the problem.
Jukes knew that it was hard work in the engine room on a day like this, and so he decided it would be a good idea to let Harry shout for a while. Perhaps after that, he would go back down below deck and do his job more quietly. But the second engineer didn't listen to Jukes's words.
Look, it's just like I thought. This ventilator's pointing in the wrong direction. I don't know what your men do all day. Do they just lie around on their fat backs?
He tried to change the direction of the ventilator, but it was too heavy to move. Jukes stopped him.
Harry, I told you before. There's nothing that we can do. There's no wind. But look, there's a storm coming.
Harry looked at the strong swell of the sea around them, and then at Jukes.
This is a dog's life,
he said angrily. And with that, he went back down to the engine room. Jukes turned round and saw McWhirr looking at him.
Why did you let him talk to you like that?
The captain asked.
You mustn't be soft with the crew. If he goes on like that, he'll have to find himself a new job on another ship very soon.
His men can't make enough steam. And it's not easy working down there when it's so hot. I understand how he feels. Even up here, on deck, I feel like I have a blanket round my head.
A blanket round your head? What do you mean? Have you ever had a blanket round your head, Jukes? What was that for?
It's just a way of speaking, sir,
said Jukes, thinking that Captain McWhirr really had a very strange way of understanding things.
Well, if there's any more talk of that kind from the second engineer, he'll have to go,
said McWhirr, and he walked away. At 8 o'clock, it was dark. Jukes went to the chart room to write the ship's log. As he did every day, he wrote the number of miles, the direction the ship was sailing in, and what kind of wind there was that day. Should he write down what he thought, or only what he could see? Under comments, he wrote,
terribly hot weather.
And
the swell is making the ship roll heavily.
He thought for 1 or 2 minutes, and then wrote,
the Chinese laborers are all safely below deck for the night. The barometer is still going down.
He was closing the log when the ship rolled very heavily. He looked out of the window. In front of his eyes, a great big dark wave climbed up higher and higher until it hid the starry sky. He wrote one more comment in the log.
From what I can see, a typhoon is on its way.
Chapter 3. The Book of Storms. After Jukes finished writing his comments in the logbook, the captain arrived in the chart room, and it was Jukes's turn to go below deck. Out on the bridge, he met the second mate, a strange man with bad teeth, a long nose, and a red angry-looking face. He never spoke much to the rest of the crew. This was his first trip on the Nan Shan.
It's a good thing for those Chinese laborers that this ship doesn't roll so easily in a storm,
said Jukes, laughing brightly.
Don't you think?
Just you wait,
said the second mate.
Do you mean to say that it's going to get worse?
Asked Jukes.
You said it, not me,
said the second mate, with a cold smile. The ship was rolling more wildly now than before, and in the end, Jukes decided that he must go back and speak to Captain MacWhirr. It was a stupid idea to sail the ship into a typhoon. They should try and do something about it. Back once more in the chart room, he found MacWhirr reading a book there.
What's the matter?
Asked MacWhirr.
The swell's getting worse, sir,
replied Jukes.
Yes, I can see that,
said MacWhirr.
Anything else?
Jukes was not sure how to begin. Then he had an idea.
I was thinking of the passengers, sir.
What passengers, Jukes?
The Chinese laborers, sir.
Well, why don't you say what you mean? I've never heard anyone talk of Chinese laborers as paying passengers before. Ha! That's a good one.
He laughed.
And what about them?
He went on.
Well, with all this rolling, a lot of water is coming into the ship's hold. That's where all the Chinese are, sir. I thought that maybe we could go east. Then the swell would come at us straight on and not make us roll from side to side.
So, you want me to move a powerful steamship 50 degrees off course to make some Chinese laborers more comfortable? I've heard some stupid things in my life, but this... And what do you want us to do after that? Go 50 degrees the other way again to finish up back on course?
I know that you don't think much of my idea, sir. But at the moment, we're busy sailing into a typhoon,
said Jukes, looking MacWhirr in the eye.
And it seems you think that we should try and sail away from it.
Jukes said nothing. This was a different Captain MacWhirr from the one he knew. MacWhirr held up the book in his hand.
I was just reading the chapter on storms in this book. I think you'd like it. If we do what it says in this book, we have to sail all over the sea trying to avoid storms. Can you believe that? Think of us sailing an extra 300 miles on our way to Fu Chao just because of bad weather. What about the extra coal? The extra time? Think of us coming into Fu Chao 2 days late. What will they say to me? Where have you been, Captain? Oh, It took us longer. We had to avoid some bad weather, I'll say. Then they'll ask, was it a very bad storm? I don't know. I'll have to answer. I didn't see it.
The captain looked at Jukes. Did the first mate understand what he was saying? McWhirr tried to explain more.
That kind of thinking is all wrong, Jukes. A storm is a storm, and a steamship has just got to go through the storms that stand in front of her as well as she can. There are some things the books can't tell you.
McWhirr stopped talking and sat down on the window seat. He pulled off his boots and put his legs up. He suddenly felt tired.
Jukes, tell them to call me if there's any change in the weather.
Yes, sir.
Answered the first mate, and with that, he walked out on deck again, closing the chart room door behind him. Captain McWhirr closed his eyes. He was tired after all that speaking. Those 20 minutes of conversation with Jukes were all that he believed about the sea and sailing. Now his head felt empty, and he could think of nothing. He opened his eyes some time later. What was that loud noise? Was it the wind? Why did no one call him? Just then, he saw Jukes's face at the open chart room door. The first mate was shouting something, but the captain couldn't hear him very well because of the wind.
Started! This suddenly! 5 minutes ago!
Cried Jukes. McWhirr tried to put on his boots. This was not easy, because the ship was now moving from side to side very wildly. At last, they were on. Through the wind, Jukes heard the captain saying,
I told you! Any change? Call me!
Jukes tried to explain.
Wind! Sudden! Northeast! Thought you! Sure! Here!
Again, the wind carried away half his words before the captain's ears could catch them.
We must try to stay on course for as long as we can,
said McWhirr. Suddenly, the Nan Shan went up over an enormous wave and ran deep down into the sea on the other side of it. Water flew over her sides. Jukes and McWhirr couldn't see anything for some minutes. When they could see again, Jukes pulled at McWhirr's arm and pointed up over their heads. Just then, all the stars went suddenly from before their eyes, and all that they could see was a heavy, coal dark sky above them. Chapter 4. The Typhoon Hits. Jukes knew that at a time like this, A ship's officer must not show his feelings. He started to tell his men to fasten anything on the ship that was moving. He wanted them to see in him a man who was not afraid of some bad weather, a man who knew that this typhoon was coming from the beginning. But with every minute, Jukes understood that this typhoon was much bigger and wilder than any other usual storm. Great waves fell noisily onto the deck, covering the Nan Shan in water from top to bottom. She was still rolling heavily from side to side, but now she began to move up and down wildly in the sea too, like an enormous animal worried sick with fear.
I'm not sure that we're going to live through this,
thought Jukes. He felt happy that Captain MacWhirr was there, for it was the captain who had to decide what to do in difficult times. And saving the crew's lives was the captain's job, not his. MacWhirr did not feel so comfortable. He knew that he and his crew could all die in this typhoon, and he knew that he must decide what to do very carefully. It was now a question of life or death. He looked in front of him, trying to understand how the typhoon worked, like a man looking deeply into the eyes of a dangerous enemy. But all was dark around him. He could see nothing, not even the ship under his feet. He felt like a man who has lost the power to see and who doesn't know where he is. Standing next to him, Duke said,
I think that we've sailed into the worst part of the typhoon.
But this was not true. The worst part came a few minutes later, and it came suddenly. The typhoon exploded around them with dangerous power. It seemed that the wind and the waves wanted to break the ship into hundreds of pieces. Many sailors tried to grab some part of the ship, but couldn't do it in time. The waves sent them flying down the deck. Jukes was thrown onto his back. It seemed to him that all of the China Sea was trying to drown him. It threw him wildly from side to side, and he heard himself shouting again and again,
My God! My God! My God!
Hurrying to find something to hold on to, his hands touched a boot, then two boots. He held on, and then he felt Captain MacWhirr's strong arms around him, pulling him up. They stood for a short while, holding on to each other. But then, the water knocked them onto the deck. At last, they found each other again, and this time, they held on to the ship's railings. The typhoon was now pulling the lifeboats off the ship. One by one, they went into the angry waters of the China Sea.
Our lifeboats have gone, sir,
shouted Jukes. Because of the noise of the wind, he couldn't hear MacWhirr's answer very well.
Can't help! Had to happen! Some things left behind!
The captain's words surprised Jukes. Was that all that MacWhirr had to say? Again, he found the captain's way of thinking strange. The first mate looked at the waves loudly hitting the deck, and tried to decide if the Nanshan would survive the typhoon. If the engines kept going, if the waves didn't break the deck, if not too much water went into the hold. But then he thought, more or less without fear.
No, she won't survive.
At the same time that he was thinking this, he felt Captain MacWhirr's heavy arm over his shoulder. He replied by putting his own arm round MacWhirr.
Will she live through this?
He asked the captain. At first, there was no answer. Only the angry noise of the wind and the sea against the ship's side. But then he heard MacWhirr's voice.
Going to? All right. Good ship. Everything well. For the best.
Jukes wasn't sure if this was more of the captain's slow but sure way of thinking, or if the ship really would be all right. But it was good to hear MacWhirr's words.
Where are crew?
Asked MacWhirr.
What say, sir?
Jukes couldn't hear his question.
Where? All the men.
Said MacWhirr. Just then, Jukes felt a hand touching his boot, then a second hand, and then he felt both these hands pulling on his trousers. A man was on his knees trying to stand up. He was using Jukes's body to help him. It was the bosun. He was a little man with short legs and long arms, who usually smiled a lot.
Is that you, sir?
He said to MacWhirr.
Yes, bosun. What have you come to tell us?
Replied MacWhirr.
It's about the Chinese laborers, sir. Well, what about them, bosun?
Said Jukes.
The sea has taken them all, sir.
Nestle Harvest Gourmet Crispy Fish-Free Fingers made with plant protein ingredients and aromatic Italian herbs.
Chapter 5. We need light.
What do you mean? The sea has taken all the Chinese laborers.
MacWhirr asked the bosun.
I saw an enormous wave. It took them all together in one big group. Are you sure about that, bosun?
Jukes asked. He didn't think the bosun was very clever. He never understood why Captain MacWhirr believed that he was good at his job.
I saw it happen with my own 2 eyes, sir,
said the bosun. He then told them everything that happened from the time that the typhoon struck. When the bosun and the rest of the crew saw that they were in a typhoon, they ran from the deck and looked for somewhere drier to escape from the worst of the storm. Many of them went to a dark room under the bridge. Here, the ship rolled as much as it did on deck, but there was less water. It was very dark, and the crew were in the middle of a typhoon for the first time. Most thought that it would be their last time too. Fear made them start shouting, and with every wave that hit the deck, their shouts became louder. One of them said that they needed a light. If the ship was going to sink, at least they could see around them before they died.
I don't like the idea of drowning in the dark,
He said.
Well, if you want a light so badly, why don't you get one yourself?
Answered the bosun. This made them shout even more, for not one of them wanted to go out into the storm. The bosun didn't want to go and look for a light either. Outside the room that they were in, anything could happen. And the nearest place to find lights was far away. But then he remembered that there were 6 lights in the hold, where all the Chinese laborers were. He decided to go to the hold and bring one back. Outside, the ship was rolling wildly from side to side. The wind, the powerful waves hitting the deck all around him, the moving ship, all seemed to be doing their best to kill him. With every step that he took, he was afraid that he would fall overboard into the angry China Sea below him. He fought his way to the hold, falling many times. The typhoon was breaking the ship into pieces, and he often had to avoid pieces of thin metal that the sea and the wind threw at him. The noise of the typhoon was terrible to hear. The wind was screaming at him. It was a noise halfway between fury and pain. But underneath the screaming wind and the noise of metal hitting metal, there was something strange and new that he could hear. A deep, thumping noise. Was it coming from the hold? It seemed that something very large and heavy was rolling from one side of the ship to the other. The bosun couldn't understand it. There was nothing large and heavy in the hold that could make that noise. But as he came closer to the hold, the thumping noise became louder and louder. At last, he arrived at the heavy metal door to the hold and pulled it slowly open. What he found inside was terrible to see. The typhoon was throwing the Chinese laborers from one side of the hold to the other. There was nothing for them to hold on to, so they could not stop themselves. When each new wave hit the ship, they rolled into a big pile on one side. Then they all rolled back into a big pile on the other side. The hold was full of their shouts and screams. The bosun also saw many little pieces of wood all around the hold, together with many round pieces of bright metal. Suddenly, he remembered the laborers' boxes. Now, they were all in pieces, and the money that was once inside them was falling all over the hold. It was like a great storm inside the ship, but a stormy sea of arms, legs, and terrified faces, not of wind and waves. And so it was that the sea took them. Forgetting the lights, which were why he went on his journey to the hold in the first place, the bosun hurried out of the room and closed the heavy door behind him quickly. He had to tell the captain about this. Crossing the deck, which had seawater all over it, he thought a number of times that the ship was sinking. There were no ladders up to the bridge now, but he half rode the waves and half climbed up to the wheelhouse. Outside, he found the second mate lying by the door.
Where's the captain?
Asked the boatswain.
Overboard, like the first mate, and like we'll all be soon.
Said the second mate, laughing strangely. On his hands and knees, the boatswain moved along the bridge away from the man, and it was then that he found Jukes and the captain. After MacWhirr heard the boatswain's words, he was silent for a while. He asked himself what was really happening down in the hold. Were the Chinese laborers on the ship fighting, or in the sea drowning? After thinking about it for some time, he turned to Jukes.
You must go down to the hold with the boatswain. If those Chinese laborers are fighting over their money, you'll have to stop them. But be careful. If anything happens to me, the ship will be under your command. See what's happened down there, and then use the speaking tube in the engine room to tell me.
Nescafe Dolce Gusto, 12-year anniversary.
Chapter 6. The Fight to Survive. When the worst part of the typhoon started, Jukes stood still and just held strongly onto the railing in front of him. He tried not to think about what would happen, about the danger that they were in. As the typhoon got worse, he stopped feeling the water and the wind on his face. He was cold and wet all over his body. His arms and legs began to feel numb, and his thoughts came slowly. In some ways, it was a good feeling. He didn't hope to survive, because hoping meant fighting for something. He couldn't fight anymore. But now, MacWhirr was waking him from this numb feeling and asking him to do something dangerous. At first, he felt angry. Why should he fight his way through the typhoon down to the hold? Because of some stupid story of the boatswain's? Didn't the captain understand that the boatswain had no idea what he was talking about? But when he heard MacWhirr's words, he knew that he had to go to the hold. There was no way to avoid it. Getting there was very difficult, because now there was no ladder from the bridge to the deck below. The boatswain held Jukes by the arms and helped him to climb down slowly onto the deck. Enormous waves were still hitting the ship, and twice they nearly went overboard. At last, they got to the hold. Just when Jukes started to open the heavy door, the boatswain grabbed him by the arm.
Be careful, sir! The wooden boxes are in pieces, and the money's all over the place. If those Chinese men think that you've come to take their money, it can easily turn dangerous.
Jukes looked inside, afraid of what he would see. The hold had a lot of water in it. Just as the bosun said, the money was all over the place. The Chinese laborers were going from one side of the hold to the other with each wave. Some of them were trying to climb a ladder that went up to a hatch. The ones at the top were hitting the hatch with their hands as hard as they could, but they couldn't open it. The ship started rolling the other way, and all the men on the ladder fell off slowly, one by one. Each one screamed as he hit the deck below. Some fell on top of the others. Then, a really enormous wave lifted the ship right up, and all the men started rolling nearer the door of the hold, where the bosun and Jukes were standing. A great wave of water, heads, legs, and arms came their way. Jukes and the bosun quickly ran out of the hold and shut the door behind them. He looked at the bosun and saw the horror on his face. Was this how his face looked too? He had no idea what to do, or if there was anything that he could do. He just had to tell McWhirr about it. At the same time, McWhirr decided to go to the wheelhouse. He had to see that everything was all right in this part of the ship. If there was a problem with the rudder, then there was no hope of surviving the typhoon. Like Jukes and the bosun, he found it very difficult to move around the ship. The wind pulled at everything that he was wearing, and when he got to the wheelhouse, he found that his rain hat was gone from off his head. This made him angry. It was worse for him than losing the lifeboats. Inside the wheelhouse, he found the second mate sitting on the floor, his head in his hands.
What are you doing here?
Asked McWhirr.
It was my turn below deck,
cried the man.
so I came in here some time back. You can't stop me.
The captain looked up at the wheelhouse clock. It was 1:30 in the morning.
A new day,
he said to himself.
You'll never see the sun come up,
cried the second mate. The captain said nothing back to him, but turned now to the helmsman. He was a sailor by the name of Hackett. He stood at the wheel, fighting to make sure that the ship stayed on course.
He's a good man to be working like that in weather like this for hour after hour,
thought McWhirr.
Is the rudder still all right?
Asked the captain.
Yes, sir,
answered Hackett.
I want you to stay at the wheel. I can't send another man to take your place here. He won't know how to control the ship as well as you. Do you think you can go on without any rest?
Sir, I can steer her all day and all night if no one talks to me,
answered the helmsman.
I see. Yes, of course. Very good. Hackett,
said McWhirr. The helmsman's answer surprised him. The captain went to the speaking tube that they used to talk with the engine room. He called into it.
Route?
He needed to see that the men in the engine room were making enough steam. This was another important part of trying to control the ship. He spoke loudly into the mouth of the speaking tube again.
Route? Are you there?
By putting his ear very close to the speaking tube, he could just hear Route's answer.
I hear you, sir. It's not too good down here, but we're doing what we can. One of the engineers is hurt, but we're still making steam. How is it up above deck?
This typhoon is really pushing us about,
answered McWhirr, looking down at the second mate, who was still sitting on the floor.
Route? Just make sure that we have enough steam.
Sir, we can't give the ship too much power. We may send her down into the waves instead of up and over them.
I know, Route. But we need enough power to steer. If we don't have that, we'll lose control of the ship, and then we'll sink.
So the wheelhouse is still all right?
Asked the chief engineer.
For now, yes. Route, I need to speak to Jukes. Is he there? I want him to finish down in the hold and come up and help me. I'm alone here. The second mate has
gone overboard?
No, he's lost his head.
For some minutes, the captain's voice was silent, but Route could hear the noise of a fight coming down the speaking tube. At last, the captain came back.
The second mate ran at me. He isn't well. I had to knock him on the head. Did you hear?
Route went off to see to the engines, but as soon as Jukes arrived in the engine room, the chief engineer pushed him over to the speaking tubes to talk to McWhirr.
I went to look at the Chinese laborers, sir, and from what I saw, this is what happened. At first, the typhoon made them afraid and quiet. Then, one of the boxes fell onto the floor of the hold and broke. When they saw the money on the floor, some tried to grab it. That started a fight. With the rolling of the ship, they went from one side of the hold to the other, and the others joined the fight. Now, the storm has broken all the boxes, and all of them are fighting over all of the money. I don't see how we can stop it now, sir. I think that some are dead, and it seems that many are hurt.
Jukes hoped that Captain McWhirr wouldn't give him any more to do in the hold. Then, the captain's answer came down the speaking tube.
Get some men and go back to the hold. Pick up all the money and put it somewhere safe. Typhoon or no typhoon, I don't want any fighting on the Nan Shan.
I have to pick up the laborers' money in the hold,
said Jukes to Route on his way out of the engine room.
What?
Replied the chief engineer.
First, the second mate goes and hits That's the captain. Now you're making the hold tidy? Haven't you officers got anything better to do?
Down in the engine room, in the deepest part of the ship, they couldn't see the enormous wall of dark seawater that was just going to hit the Nan Shan.
Nak terungkap potensi, kena bertenaga. Tak kira di pentas, di jalanan atau depan lensa. Milo Cans, pastikan kau bertenaga untuk terus mara.
Chapter 7. The Storm in the Hold. The dark wave that came quickly nearer and nearer to the Nan Shan looked as high